Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Welcome to a special bonus bite from Apple Size Podcast, and this one is solely focusing on Australia's encryption bill. And who I've invited onto this episode is none other than Andrew from The Curb, also another Ozcast Network podcast. So, hey Andrew, I know you're keen on following your politics and commentary and all that sort of thing. So,
I am, yeah.
Yes, what better person to invite on the show for this topic?
Yeah, thank you very much, and hello everybody. Thanks Simon for getting me on here to talk about Australian politics. I promise I won't bore you guys to death with this, but I do absolutely love Australian politics and diving into it a little bit too much, which is not healthy, I'm sure.
This has been a long time coming. So I've actually known of Andrew's work even prior to The Curb, when he was running AB Film Review in The Last New Wave. When I actually first started Apple Size Podcast, and there were different Facebook podcast groups, and I noticed him commenting there, and he happened to also be from WA as well. So this is also another first. So while I've done a couple of in-person guest spots, this is my first one over a Skype call in the same time zone. Thank goodness.
Yeah. It's great, isn't it? Like I didn't have to bring out timeconverter.com to find out, if the place I'm talking to has got daylight savings or anything like that. It's easy. You just said 8:30 and I was there, set. So it's great. It's nice.
It is crazy to me that currently, with daylight savings in the various places it applies to, that South Australia is ahead of Queensland. That just boggles my mind.
Yeah, but Queensland's behind in a lot of ways, not just time. So, it's understandable.
Hey, I did grow up there, but,
So did I as well. So I feel like I can have a slide dig at Queensland every so often. That's my one for this.
License to dig.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, this encryption bill, the way that it applies to both of us is we're both into tech. We are from essentially the rival sides, myself being Apple, obviously, and yourself being into Android products. But this is something that affects those two areas of technology and beyond. So let's just start with what this actual issue is. So the nutshell of this bill is basically, in the event that the Australian government they want to be able to access encrypted messages and data, whether it's something involving terrorism or some other form of criminal case, which echoes very closely what happened, I think it was about a year ago, with the San Bernardino case in America, where the FBI wanted access to the criminal's iPhone, and they asked Apple to, hey, we want to be able to get into it. And they're like, no, once we create a backdoor into the operating system, who knows what could happen if that lands in the wrong hands. So essentially what we have is with this bill, with the Australian government, is we have them saying, okay, we want to be able to get as much information as we can if something involving terrorists or the like arises. And we want the big tech companies who are responsible for creating this software to give us a backdoor into their system so we can access encrypted data. And the tech companies are saying, no, that is just going to leave the entire system vulnerable to any sort of attack. So while they can understand the need to access encrypted data, it's just too much of a risk overall, because you think of just the millions and millions of people that use iOS, use Android and everything, and the trade-off is it's far too obvious as to which way it should go. In a few episodes ago, I quickly covered Apple's letter to the Australian government. This is when they were proposing the bill. And a quick little excerpt from it. that every day over 1 trillion transactions occur safely over the internet as a result of encrypted communications. These range from online banking to credit card transactions to the exchange of healthcare records, from photos of a new grandchild to messages exchanged between loved ones. The threats to those communications and data are very real and increasingly sophisticated. The way that I see it is, how would you like to pitch this to someone on a personal level? So you could ask someone, okay, yep, you might be freaking out about terrorism and you want the Australian government to solve it, but do you want them to be able to solve it at the risk of anybody being able to jump in and grab all your data, all your records, all your personal photos and everything?
Well, see, that's where, like, the Liberal government like to use a term called, does it pass the pub test? And this one would easily pass the pub test, because I would hazard a guess and say the majority of Australians would fall under the purview of saying, well, I haven't done anything wrong, so therefore I have nothing to hide, which, you know, on the surface is kind of true. Like, you know, same with the metadata bills that passed a few years ago, where essentially, you know, the government can keep track on exactly where you've been and what you've done and all this kind of stuff, all thanks to your metadata. And majority of people aren't going to have done something wrong. So I don't think they're going to care about this. They just want to feel safer. I just want to add as well, the bill is called the Access and Assistance Bill, which I think is kind of amusing, because the whole entire point of the bill is that, you know, basically the Australian government says to these tech companies, hey, can you just create something so that we can have a look at what these messages say? We're going to give you the names of these people that we think are doing something nefarious. Can you just have a look and see what they're saying? And so it's they want to classify it as not really a backdoor and more like a window, like you're looking in and just reading, you know, through the window what they have to say. So they're not cracking open anything technically, but there is still the possibility that that could occur. It is a real problem in a lot of ways for those who are tech-minded and concerned about privacy. And, you know, yes, we may not have anything to hide, but as you mentioned, there are millions of people at stake here who, you know, we use these apps on a daily basis. We use WhatsApp, you know, Facebook Messenger, and all these kinds of apps that have this kind of encryption built into it. We still want to feel safe. We don't want somebody finding out about whatever's going on in our day-to-day lives. And yeah, I don't know. I don't think the Australian public cares. I think there is a minority of people who do care about it, and we're that minority, which is a really, you know, it's not what people want to hear. Like, I think we live in a bit of an echo chamber sometimes on Facebook and things like that, and Twitter and stuff, where you've cultivated these people who you talk to and then tend to forget that there is a wider world out there who simply has no interest in, you know, this kind of thing. I think that's the case. Do you find that that's, you know, that we have that kind of echo chamber, that people just don't care about it?
Well, the amount of people I know that don't even have a passcode on their phone,
right?
That kind of says it all.
That's terrifying.
Like, they think it's too much of an inconvenience to bother putting in a passcode. I'm like, why don't you use Touch ID? Why don't you use Face ID or whatever? And they're just like, oh no, I never used a passcode before. I'm fine. I'm like, what if you leave your phone behind and someone just picks it up and they've got full access to it, and they're just like, oh yeah, you know, I guess I probably should. And it's just like that kind of lax nature is crazy to me, and that's why I feel like, much along the lines of what you're saying, is that if there's enough people like that, they don't even put something as simple as a passcode or any form of you know, lock on their phone, then does this stuff, if you're trying to explain it to them, does it even really matter to them? So it is hard to accept the fact that what you're saying is most likely correct, in the fact that we are the people that are mostly concerned with it are the minority. It's the hardest bit about this is obviously the current government are using the terrorism angle as a way to really push the need for the bill. And we know what people are like that. Terrorism plus newspapers plus certain news sites. Yeah, I mean, you know how it goes.
Yeah, well, definitely. And I think, you know, I think the key thing that people need to remember at the moment is that there is an election coming up in the next 6 months. And that's part of the reason why, if there wasn't an election coming up, I don't think that the Australian Labor Party would have actually supported the bill as it is. They would eventually have passed it because, they're in a rock and a hard place. If you look historically, Labor are not the people that bring in security measures. It's always been the Liberal Party that's brought in security measures, and then it's been Labor that have amped those security measures up in different ways.
We should just point out the classic thing that all Australians have to do when talking about politics. For the international listeners,
oh yes,
is the Liberal Party are completely different than what most people would regard as liberals, say like in USA. So the Liberal Party are our conservative, generally centre to right-wing party. So
yeah, the right-leaning guys who are terrified of the world at large, and Labor, unfortunately, given the way that politics works in Australia, Labor have been kind of towed in line to try and win votes from Liberal Party, and they have to do these kinds of things to gain those kinds of votes away from the Liberal Party. And I think that's part of the reason why they eventually, folded and said, all right, we have all these amendments that we actually want to put forward into this bill, but we're going to let it go as is, and then we'll debate those in February when we come back for our 8 days of work next year. Because they don't want to have essentially 3 months of people arguing that, hey, the Labor Party doesn't care about our safety and all this kind of stuff. And, I don't mean to get too left-leaning for a moment here, but I have to ask, what major event was going to occur that this particular bill is the only thing that was ever going to stop it? Like if they have an inkling that something major is going to occur and this is the only thing that's going to stop it, then, I kind of think that's okay that they pass it, but it doesn't seem like that's the case. It seems just like, hey, the Liberal Party wanted to get this passed and they've got Labor into a bind and know that they're going to have to be in a tight corner to get it passed. And I understand it. I understand it as somebody who follows politics. I understand all of this as somebody who, I care about where the country goes and where the two major parties go and stuff like that. But I think that the majority of people around Australia simply have no interest. Or if they do have an interest, they'll ask, well, what's my member of parliament actually doing for me? And this feels like such a small fry thing. And it's the same with debating, refugees and stuff like that. It's such a small fry thing for majority of people in Australia where they're like, well, what does this have to do with me? As long as I feel safe, then that's fine. And I think this bill on paper makes people feel safe because coming back to what I said before, they'll all believe that, hey, we've actually not done anything really wrong, which is, I don't know. I understand where the Labor Party has come from in voting for this. Do I agree with it? Maybe, even though I think it's morally wrong.
Did they have any mention of what their amendments would be?
No, because they're essentially the bill is 172 pages long. Labor Party. A bit of history about this. This bill has been around for a long while. It's been around for essentially about 18 months. And it's been, the Labor Party have always wanted to read it because it's a pretty big major, bit of legislation that they will have to assess and discuss and vote on. And then they were only given a very short period of time to actually look at it. And in turn, there was also a very small period of time for them to look at the public submissions, which I think, there was quite a fair few public submissions, but they're only given about 2 or 3 weeks to actually look at that. And so, for a major bill and 172 pages of really dense legislation material, which, if anybody has actually tried to read legislation material, I think it's fascinating, but it'll put most people to sleep. And that's the intention is that, you've got 172 pages of it, you're going to fall asleep come page 6 and miss out on the interesting stuff that you should probably pay attention to. And that's usually what each party tries to do in some regards, to trip the other one up and pass it just because. So in that regard, I don't know. I don't know. I think, both parties are already in election mode at the moment, and they're trying to do as much as they can to win votes. And is, in a way, the only way that Labor is going to get out on front with this is to pass the legislation, essentially pass the legislation, because the people who would get upset about it and not vote for Labor because of this is such a small group of people compared to the people who would be angry at them for having not passed it in the first place. So damned if you do, damned if you don't. And, they chose the damned if they do pile because it's going to work out better off for them.
It was disappointing to see, but given the circumstances of what happens, particularly with the very short time frame, and as you said, expected upcoming election, so they're definitely any possible little decision they've got to weigh up. Okay, is this going to gain or lose us votes? So I am very interested to see what the amendments will be. I think if they do pass it as is, and it's much the same as the 172 pages are, it won't be a deal breaker for me in the way of that's who I would vote for.
Labor is playing a very interesting game in this regard, where they're essentially, have said to the government, look, we're going to pass this legislation on the proviso that you're going to allow us to discuss and pass these amendments in the new year. And that is we've all seen what the Liberal Party is capable of over the past 5 years. I'm not sure if I would trust them to be, saying, hey, look, we'll do what you want, but, as long as we get to do something in the future. I don't know if the Liberal Party is even going to actually say, yeah, no worries. We're going to hold on to that promise.
I assume that they have no idea what the amendments are.
They didn't get a chance to discuss the amendments.
Of course, because that's how short the time frame was.
Yeah. So how it works basically is if they discuss the amendments in the Senate, so a legislation is created in the House of Representatives. It goes to the Senate. Some amendments are suggested. They have to go back to the House of Representatives to vote on those amendments. It passes in the House of Representatives again, and then it goes back to the Senate where they pass it again. So the bill has already been passed in the House of Representatives because it needs to go through to a committee to discuss it and explore what's actually in the legislation and then come up with amendments. So it already passed that process and hit the Senate. And they were essentially discussing, which is what they were dragging out on Thursday, which was quite disgusting behaviour from the Liberal Party, because there was a lot of filibustering going on to try and stop a medical evacuation bill regarding refugees on Manus Island and Nauru. And so they played this huge stalling game regarding both legislations. And the medical evacuation legislation couldn't pass because it needed the amendments approved in the Senate and then to go back to the House of Representatives to pass there. Those amendments for that particular legislation had passed in the Senate, but because 4:30 came along on the clock and the Liberal government basically said, oh, we're done, we've got to go home now, they finished up. They decided to stop discussing the legislation. So in turn, the Senate can stick around until 6, 7 o'clock, midnight, 1 a.m. for as long as it needs. And so they stuck around and discussed this new assistance bill, essentially, and decided, you know what, we're going to pass it because we want to keep Australia safe. And on the proviso that we can discuss, I think the Labor Party had something like 70 or so amendments for the bill, so it's not a short amount. So that each amendment is quite a big discussion in the Senate. So it will go back to the House of Representatives in the new year. They will discuss it there, and then it will go back to the Senate for further discussions and amendments and stuff like that. So see what happens in the new year. But again, I don't trust the Liberal Party to allow this to occur.
It certainly sounds like with this bill that they're not short on amendments.
That's a good one, Simon.
I have a criteria. There must be at least one piece of wordplay or punnery per episode.
I'll pay it for.
Okay, cool. Because usually I get a bit of the awkward scoffing or the nice one. So yours is a more enthusiastic reply. So thank you for entertaining me.
Well, you've got a very political keen person, so political puns are my candy. I enjoy that kind of stuff.
Okay, so right before we recorded, we started discussing this, And I think we ultimately came to the conclusion that, okay, if this passes, how is this actually going to affect the tech companies from actually creating this window/backdoor with Apple or Google or whoever in Australia? They go, okay, yep, this thing has happened, yet we need you to do this. I mean, it's no quick thing.
It's not, and that's what I don't understand, is that they're like, we have to get this passed before Christmas. Well, I'm sorry, guys, Christmas is 2 weeks away, and you can't essentially create this look into encryption and making these messages legible by Christmas. And not only that, but enforcing companies to actually do that, it's got to be very difficult. Now, I haven't read enough about what different companies have said, but I do wonder if it's going to be a little bit like when Australia implemented GST on items bought internationally and coming into Australia, and Amazon basically went, that's not going to happen. Australians can't buy from the main website and all this kind of stuff, and got a little bit upset about it. And so therefore Australians weren't able to buy from Amazon.com and had to go to Amazon.com.au. And I wonder if it's going to be a little bit like that, where, basically, because there's only 24 million Australians here, and so the user base for Facebook and these different apps is probably pretty small. So I wonder if, the companies might look at it and just go, we've got billions of people around the world using this particular app. If we don't service Australia, then so be it. No worries, that's fine. And so instead of actually cooperating with the government, they will just basically, I wonder if they'll just say, nah, no worries, we're not going to even worry about Australia. A bit like they don't worry about China because China has, restrictive things. And I know that's a little bit alarmist to say that Australia might be like China. I don't mean it like that, but I'm just saying, maybe they might do that. I'm not sure. Have you seen anything from different app companies and stuff like that mentioning or talking about what they might do with this?
No, I've only seen I think it's 7 or 8 page letter from Apple that was sent to the Australian government back in October. It was literally like, hey, okay, we get what you mean, and we understand where you're coming from, but we're not going to screw this whole thing up. These instances, which may be very few anyway.
Yeah. And so there's an article from ABC, which I've read earlier today. And one of the interesting things which I noted, and this is where the Greens kind of come in some regards, because Scott Ludlam used to be very into all this kind of, cryptocurrency and awareness of, the dark web and all this kind of stuff, and getting people understanding Tor and VPNs and all these kind of things to get around metadata retention and different ways that the government basically monitors your activity online. And one of the quotes which is mentioned on there is from this girl from Girl Geek Academy, the head of Girl Geek Academy, Sarah Moran, and she mentions right at the bottom of this article, as they said, they've left us with this Christmas bonbon, and we don't understand what will be coming to our businesses in the future. Do the politicians not understand the internet, or do they understand and do not care? Clear prohibitions against undermining security will ensure that providers can't be asked to do things that makes their products less safe. So, and that's it. That's the key thing, by asking, companies to essentially make their products less safe, because, who knows what is possible. And obviously we've already seen around the world that, different data breaches and different breaches of apps and things like that, it happens regularly. And sometimes we may not even find out about it until years after it occurred, a bit like the catch of the day. The website got hacked years ago, and it took them 2 years to advise customers that, hey, all your data got stolen, but don't worry about it, it's okay. And so, for the government to essentially say, hey, we need you to do something and find out stuff on illegal people, and in turn opening them up to possibilities of that kind of thing occurring, is possibly in itself illegal. I don't know the full ins and outs of it, but there's a possibility of that. And I just don't think that companies are going to be open to it at all. I really don't. And it comes back to what I was saying. I think that, a lot of them would just turn their backs on Australia.
One of the sentences on the opening page of Apple's letter, which I think really kind of sums us up well, is when they're obviously talking about criminals and terrorists, is they say, in the face of these threats, this is no time to weaken encryption. There is profound risk of making criminals' jobs easier, not harder. Increasingly stronger, not weaker, encryption is the best way to protect against these threats. So they're really trying to, spell it out to them as a way of like, hey, you're gonna mess up a good thing. This is something that they're. Obviously, I'm speaking from the Apple perspective, and I know that they take a very strong stance on the security and privacy aspects of the software and all the different platforms. And so it's almost like, hey, they've been dedicated to this cause for so long, and they're not just gonna throw it all away just for a single bill.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't matter, so Christopher Pine, who's the head of the House in House of Representatives, he tweeted something out and quickly deleted it, which is fair that he quickly deleted it, but it's the internet, and the internet never forgets. And he said, Labor has chosen to allow terrorists and paedophiles to continue their evil work in order to engage in point scoring. #Ozpol. And that's the thing, is that, the politicians prefer to use alarmist terms like paedophile and terrorist to basically, drum up a little bit of fear so that, they're on board with this kind of thing. And they think that it's a good thing that, tech companies like Apple and Facebook and all that are forced to break their encryption, which is sad. It's just sad. And I don't know. I mean, Apple is the first $1 trillion company in the world. And I think that Australia's debt is probably $1 trillion. That's overdoing it, but essentially, I'm just saying, it then comes into a difficult area, which is not something we go into, but it's a difficult area of where then you have massive corporations dictating what governments can and can't do. But then on the flip side, and this is the gray area where it's like half of me is like, yes, I want the government to be able to tell Apple and Facebook what to do. But then on the flip side, I'm also kind of like, but I don't want them to do all this kind of stuff. So it's a murky gray area. And I find myself, I find myself being a little bit frustrated by it, but as I think about it more and more day after day, and it's only been 2 days since this passed, but I've done a lot of thinking about it, and I'm like, okay, sure, if this is the case, then I fear that I'm falling over to the side of when metadata came about, the scouring of metadata came about and all that kind of stuff. I was just a bit like, I was falling into the realm of the people who are very much like, I've done nothing wrong. And my frame of mind now is kind of turned into a really sad point of view, which is, well, it's inevitably going to happen, so why try and stop it? And so that's where my frame of mind is a bit lately, where I'm a bit like, well, why try and stop it? Because it's eventually going to happen anyway. So therefore, just try and find out ways that you can combat it your own personal way, which is like having a VPN on all the time and stuff like that. And I think that's one thing which I find hilarious, is that, the government forgets that a lot of the government institutions that we use, like your hospitals and stuff like that, and places where you've got massive amount of data, they already use their own kind of VPN. And so, people are aware that these services are available, and which then in turn, like if the terrorists and pedophiles are out there, then they're probably already using these. So the actual purview of this bill will be pointless, because these are people who will be appearing in different countries anyway. So therefore, they'll be out of, they may live in Australia, but then they'll be out of the realm of what the legislation is supposed to do, because they're not being scoured or assessed. And I think that's, I don't know, it's hard.
I think the frustrating thing is that we are in, particularly with just how far, technology and obviously introduction of social media and everything has happened over the past 10, 15 years, And I think that there is change in motion of, as politicians come and go and we introduce younger ones and then they spend their time in politics and that, and they're generally more knowledgeable about this stuff. I think that, say, even 10 years from now and beyond, we'll probably have a bit more faith in terms of the government knowing what they're talking about when it comes to these sort of things relating to technology. Because, I remember when the whole metadata thing was, that was like the hot topic, and no politician could actually explain to anyone what metadata was. It's like everyone was just trying to guess, here's this hot word and we're going to use it for political debate, but no one could actually explain what it was. And that's what I hate about this, is it's like there's this encryption bill, and obviously with the Liberal government being the ones currently in power, it's just like they're pushing the safety of Australia, terrorism and stuff as a way to gain the public's vote for it. But I don't think they don't understand the weight of what they could do if they're forcing tech companies to open up their systems.
Yeah.
It's like you're just like some old fogies in Canberra that just, you're trying to make it sound like you know what you're talking about. So, a perfect example, what happened when we had the initial plans for NBN, then the Liberal government got in, and we know how the NBN rollout's been going. So, it's a frustrating thing, because I feel like people of our generation, we're far more, and obviously you and I being more tech-minded, we're far more in tune with this sort of stuff. And I feel like it's like, come on, don't you have someone that is a bit more full bottle on this in Parliament that could be advising you on this sort of thing?
Well, yes, they do. And the people that are those people are, I can't remember his surname, but Jordan, who took over from Scott Ludlam as the senator for the Greens in WA, he's essentially taken up the mantle of being the tech guy for the Greens, like Scott was. And the frustrating thing is that a lot of the information and stuff that gets brought up from both of these guys that were in Parliament, they got ignored by Labor and Liberals simply because they were Greens. And they were saying a lot of logical stuff, but unfortunately, less so on Liberal side, they simply don't have anybody. But Labor really, they may have people who like to think that they know what they're talking about. Tony Burke, for example, likes to think that he knows what he's talking about. And sometimes he's right, but most of the time not. Jordan was able to say, you know what, loot crate box assembling and the most popular game out at the moment, Fortnite, has these loot crate boxes in it, and your kids are playing it. And, parents out there in the world know what Fortnite is, so they're aware of that. And then you throw in the word gambling and, ears get pricked up and they pay attention and they focus on the word gambling. And that's where it comes to this encryption bill, they focus on the words terrorism and paedophilia and things like that. And that's where you get people like Bob Catter, for example, who, he's, for people who don't know, you might have seen his videos on John Oliver's show, if you're an international listener, but he is a, far right kind of leaning guy, and he comes from the middle of nowhere in Queensland. And he probably has no idea about any of this. You try to explain it to him, it'll go right over his head. But you mention terrorism and paedophilia, and then they're on board. And therefore, as well, as soon as you mention those things, then anybody who's suddenly against it is wrong. And that's where we stand at Australian politics. And I think that's where we stand in politics around the world. And, I think that's where a lot of people around the world would look at this, and logical people like us would sit there and go, well, this is mad. But governments, they don't have that luxury. They've got 70-something people, 76 people are needed to pass the legislation in the House of Representatives, and there's 140-something there. And they all sit there and, try and think all of these things, and it gets diluted down to one sentence. And that's how we end up with these terrible laws. It's terrible.
Going back to your, this is very frustrating. Going back to your sort of inner turmoil about, in the sense of whether, you don't want big corporations telling governments what to do, etc. Yeah, when it comes down to stuff that is certainly, people are well versed in, like paying tax and all that sort of thing, getting huge companies to pay the right tax, yeah, for sure. Like, they should have the full power to tell them to do that, because that's how it should go. That's how it's got to be fair, right? But it's just when it comes to the topic of this sort of thing, like encryption and just understanding the severity of any changes to what is like years and years of building up a very like tight knit, fully integrated system. That's where I'm like, no, like they're out of their depth there, and they really should be listening to the advice of the Apples and the Googles and stuff, who are the people who are innovating and leading in these spaces. It's like,
yeah, definitely. And I think as you mentioned before, you know, we're young guys, and there is a new generation of people coming into politics, and you know, hopefully that new generation will be more in tune with it. And one of the things that Bill Shorten's Labor government actually wants to bring in, and I think that they still do. I haven't checked lately, but they did 2 years ago. So I think that they probably still want to do it, which is bring in compulsory learning coding in schools. Yeah. Which is fantastic. And
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, it's something which I would have loved to have learned a lot more about. But I'm of a generation where that wasn't even a thought. But if there is a generation that's raised up on coding, then they'll become more aware of this kind of stuff. And in turn, when people then move into a world of politics and get more engaged in politics, then they might be able to change these kinds of things that we made in 2018. And, you know, sure, so it may take 10 years or 15 years to do so, but... I
was really psyched on that, because not only for years have Apple had a big focus on their everyone can code workshops and stuff that they do for people of all ages, and even getting like kids to learn how to code with their Swift Playgrounds app and everything. I was like, this is awesome. And then when I saw, it must have been probably like a year ago or so when I saw Labor talking about, bringing coding into schools. That's the sort of thing I'm like, okay, this is great, because they recognize that just with the way the world is going, with the reliance on technologies, there's going to be more jobs for coders out there, and there's going to be a space to fill, and Australia really needs to kind of like get on the forefront in that area. So yeah, when I see things like that, I get excited. And then when I saw things like just at the time of like, oh yeah, they support the encryption bill, I was like, oh, what the hell's going on? And then after the fact, I found about the whole time crunch scenario. I was like, okay, yeah, well, I can see that. So for me, in terms of what happens next, it's really going to... I'm really interested to see what these amendments are. And then finally, if it does pass through, and if anything does arise and one of these companies is asked to give them the access, what actually happens at that point. I love the fact that there's someone like yourself that's so focused on what's actually happening with the politics in our country. I don't want people to just throw their hands up and then end up just making an uninformed choice when it comes to voting, because it is compulsory here also for international listeners. And yeah, so I kind of think that that's also a little like side note to this, is hopefully things like the encryption bill and what's happening, and the choice that kind of like Labor were forced to make in this pre-election buzz, that it might bring back some interest to you in terms of what will happen in the next election and other sort of technology related bills and things that come up, because there will be more of this stuff for sure.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And as I mentioned earlier, like, Labor is not a party that brings in surveillance legislation. They're traditionally not a party that has ever brought in anything like that. They're not that kind of party. They don't have that kind of framework that they have in their party. They're just not that kind of group. And so I'm a little bit more hopeful. I mean, essentially when Bill Shorten gets in, we'll have about 8 years of all of that kind of stuff, and that's good. That's fine, and I think that we'll have less of this kind of, metadata and encryption stuff being brought up. especially because I'm very hopeful that they'll have a majority, an easy majority in the House of Representatives, and won't be beholden to people like Tony Abbott and things like that.
Still lurking in the background. Now, the final piece to wrap this up is, what's your prediction for an election? Like, when do you think it'll happen?
May 18th. Don't book a holiday on May 18th, people.
That's a very specific date. How do you arrive at that?
It's the last day that they can have it.
Okay, wow, yeah.
Yeah. It's the last day that you can have it, and I can guarantee you Scott Morrison is going to do all that he can to ensure that he's not going anywhere. He's going to do everything he can, and he pull every trick out of the hat to ensure that stay around as long as he can. And granted that the Parliament is only sitting for 8 days next year. Now, when people talk about the Parliament only sitting for 8 days, it means the House of Representatives is only sitting for 8 days. So legislation and moves against the sitting Parliament can only occur in those 8 days. And it's broken up because of where the election cycle has landed, and because usually we would have had an election called by then, they had to push forward the announcement of when they're actually having the budget. So if they go to the furthest amount of the latest date essentially that they can call an election, which is May 18, then they need to have a budget beforehand, because usually the budget occurs in May. So the budget will be occurring in the beginning of April. And it has to occur in the beginning of April because it can't occur at the end of April because you got Easter. And so they're going to monopolize on a lot of these different dates, these public holidays and things like that. And having Easter when it is, and then an election when it is as well, works in the Liberals' favour, because you can't really go out and, canvass the public on Easter. You've got 4 days essentially of not doing anything, which is what the Liberal Party want. They don't really want to make all too much noise, but they do want to try and prove that they're actually valuable.
Yeah.
And so, that's it. May 18th is when it's going to occur.
You heard it here first.
And I know that people talk about, but what about a vote of no confidence in the government? And a vote of no confidence is where a basic majority, so 76 people in the House of Representatives, essentially vote and say that they have no confidence in the government. And that requires, so there are 69 Labor members, and the rest, and there are 69 Liberals off the top of my head. And so the rest of them are crossbenchers. I'm not sure if the maths is adding up on that, but regardless, basically, they need 7 of the crossbenchers to assist and say that there is a vote of no confidence. And the government, the Labor Party, tried to make moves for these kinds of things to occur this week, but they did not have the numbers. They won the vote, so they got more than half, but they didn't have a basic majority of 76. Okay, and the reason for that is a lot of these crossbenchers are ex-Liberal members because they got upset about what's been going on. That's a whole different kettle of fish, but
one recently ex-Liberal, yes, as well. A lot going on.
Yeah. So that won't happen. May 18th it is. Don't book a holiday then. You will be at a poll and getting a democracy sausage then.
So I hope that from our discussion, whether you are, typically around the centre or left-leaning or even right-leaning, and you listen to this show, that you can understand the importance of where we're coming from for this encryption bill. I keep calling it that, but that's technically not what it's called.
Well, they always come up with stupid names for it. It's access and assistance bill, which I love it, because the assistance they want from the tech companies and the it's not going to happen.
That wraps up this bonus slide focusing on the accents. We're focusing on accents, okay? The access and assistance bill. Sorry, I've had too many little creatures tonight. I hope to have more of these, particularly when, we'll follow the movements of what happens when the amendments are delivered, if we find out about that.
Yeah, so that'll be the second week of February, so February 12th, I think it is when Parliament goes back to go and sit down and sort out all of these things. And as an interesting side note, so if... small trivia, a sitting government has never lost a legislation vote in 90 years. And that will occur next year when Parliament goes back to sit, because of the medical evacuation bill is something that the government didn't originate and people outside the government originated it. So Labor and crossbenchers originated. It's particularly Karen Phelps. So the government will be in a bad position because they will lose that vote. It will pass, and it's not a government legislation that they created. And that's the first time in 90 years that it occurred. So it's egg on their face, and they'll be looking angry. So again, that comes back to me looking cynical about whether these amendments will have been passed. But I'd love to discuss them for
great.
sure.
If in the interim you'd love to hear more about Australian politics and all other awesome things such as Australian film and I don't know, a whole range of topics.
Stuff.
Then please, stuff. If you want to listen to Culture Unity reviews and banter.
That's the one, yes.
That's the one.
$5 is in the post, thanks.
Yes, Andrew's podcast, The Curb, and of course his website, thecurb.com.au. There's plenty of great stuff to get onto there. And Andrew himself, as I mentioned at the start, is also part of Ozcast Network, like Apple Slice are. So us, and from the previous episode with Dave from Barely Audible, and plenty other podcasts. Big diverse range as well, and they're growing more and more each time. So this is great. So definitely go to ozcastnetwork.com. That's AUSCAST network.com. And of course, Apple Slice with all our social posts and everything. We got Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And I post all the episodes and descriptions to appleslice.com.au. Thanks again, Andrew.
Well, thank you.
And I guess we'll have to lock in a mid-Feb to catch up about what's happening with the latest movements in the bill.
Yeah, I'll be watching it. I'll be there.
It's been great having a chat after all this time, Andrew, and I look forward to having you on again.
Yeah, thank you very much, Simon. I appreciate it.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.